Hello and welcome to History Bedtime Stories. Her real name is lost to history, her actual appearance unknown. Her voice silenced by 3,000 years of male poets who rewrote her story to fit their narrative of beauty, desire, and war. But in the ruins of Bronze Age Anatolia, in the diplomatic correspondence between ancient empires, in the archaeological evidence scattered across Turkey and Greece, fragments of the real woman behind Helen of Troy are finally emerging. She wasn't a passive beauty prize fought over by men. She was likely a powerful figure in her own right, perhaps even a priestess queen whose religious and political significance made her the most valuable person in the ancient Mediterranean. Tonight, we're giving her back her voice. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Greece, around the 12th or 13th century BCE. Picture a world where gods walked among mortals, where honor meant everything, and where a single woman's fate could determine the destiny of entire civilizations. Tonight, we're going to separate fact from fiction, explore the archaeological evidence, and discover how Helen of Troy became both history's most famous beauty and its most misunderstood woman. Our story begins not in Troy, but in Sparta, in the heart of the Peloponnese. Helen's origins are shrouded in mythology, but beneath the layers of divine intervention and supernatural elements lies a story that reflects the very real political and social dynamics of Bronze Age Greece. According to the ancient sources, Helen was born to Leda, the queen of Sparta, but her parentage is where the story becomes immediately complicated. The most famous version tells us that Zeus, the king of the gods, was so enamored with Leda's beauty that he transformed himself into a swan to seduce her. From this union came Helen, born from an egg along with her brothers Castor and Pollux, the famous Dioscuri. But here's where we need to pause and consider what this myth might actually represent. Ancient Greek storytellers often used divine parentage to explain exceptional individuals, those whose beauty, strength, or intelligence seemed almost superhuman. Helen's supposed divine heritage wasn't just a fantastical element. It was a way of emphasizing her extraordinary nature and perhaps legitimizing her later actions and the reverence she inspired. More historically grounded accounts suggest that Helen was indeed the daughter of Tyndareus, king of Sparta, and his wife Leda. This would make her a genuine Spartan princess, born into one of the most powerful royal families in Bronze Age Greece. And this is crucial to understanding Helen's story, because Sparta wasn't just any kingdom. It was one of the most significant powers in the Mycenaean world. The Sparta of Helen's time was vastly different from the militaristic society we often associate with the classical period. This was Mycenaean Sparta, part of the broader late Bronze Age civilization that dominated Greece from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pylos and Tiryns shows us a world of sophisticated palace complexes, extensive trade networks, and complex administrative systems recorded in linear script. Helen would have grown up in a world of luxury and political intrigue. Spartan princesses were not sequestered away from public life as they might be in other cultures. Spartan women, even in the Bronze Age, enjoyed more freedom and respect than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. They could own property, participate in religious ceremonies, and were expected to be physically strong and intellectually capable. From childhood, Helen would have been aware of her exceptional beauty. Ancient sources consistently describe her as the most beautiful woman in the world, a description that has persisted for over 3 millennia. But we must understand that in ancient Greece, beauty wasn't just about physical appearance. It was seen as a sign of divine favor, of aristocratic breeding, and of moral and spiritual worth. This concept of beauty as virtue was deeply embedded in Greek culture. The Greek word kalos meant both beautiful and good, suggesting that physical beauty and moral excellence were intrinsically linked. Helen's beauty, therefore, wasn't just a matter of personal vanity. It was a political and religious statement about her worthiness to rule and her connection to the divine. As Helen reached marriageable age, probably around 14 or 15, which was typical for aristocratic women of the period, her beauty had become legendary throughout Greece. Suitors began arriving in Sparta from every corner of the Greek world, each hoping to win the hand of the most beautiful woman alive. This is where our story takes on the dimensions of an ancient political thriller. Helen wasn't just a bride to be won. She was a prize that would bring immense prestige and political advantage to whoever married her. Sparta was one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms in Greece. An alliance through marriage with the Spartan royal house was the ultimate diplomatic coup. The list of Helen's suitors reads like a who's who of Bronze Age Greek nobility. There was Ajax the Great, son of Telamon and one of the mightiest warriors of his generation. Diomedes of Argos, whose kingdom controlled vital trade routes. Philoctetes, the master archer. Idomeneus of Crete, representing the sophisticated Minoan-influenced culture of that island. And many others, kings, princes, and heroes from across the Greek world. But two suitors stood out above all others. Menelaus of Mycenae and Agamemnon's brother, representing the most powerful kingdom in Greece, and Patroclus, representing various other powerful alliances. The competition for Helen's hand was so intense that Tyndareus feared choosing any one suitor might lead to war among the rejected candidates. It was at this crucial moment that Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, proposed a solution that would have far-reaching consequences for all of Greece. He suggested that all the suitors swear an oath to accept Helen's choice of husband and, more importantly, to come to the aid of her chosen husband if anyone should ever try to steal her away or harm her marriage. This oath, known as the Oath of Tyndareus, seemed like a clever diplomatic solution at the time. It would prevent immediate conflict among the suitors and create a mutual defense pact centered around Helen's marriage. But as we'll see, this oath would eventually drag all of Greece into the most devastating war of the Bronze Age. Helen chose Menelaus, and the choice makes perfect political sense. Menelaus was the brother of Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece. Marrying Menelaus would align Sparta with the dominant Mycenaean power bloc and secure Helen's position as one of the most important queens in the Greek world. But was this really Helen's choice? Ancient sources are ambiguous on this point, and we must consider the possibility that this was a political arrangement made by Tyndareus and Agamemnon, with Helen's supposed choice being a diplomatic fiction designed to make the alliance seem more legitimate. The wedding of Helen and Menelaus was celebrated throughout Greece as the union of two great houses. Helen left Sparta to live in Mycenae, though she would have retained her rights and connections to her homeland. She bore Menelaus a daughter, Hermione, and seemed to settle into the role of a powerful Bronze Age queen. For several years, Helen lived what appeared to be a conventional royal life. She would have managed vast household staffs, overseen religious ceremonies, participated in diplomatic functions, and raised her daughter according to the highest standards of aristocratic education. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean palaces shows us that queens had significant administrative responsibilities, often managing complex economic operations involving hundreds of workers. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect royal marriage, tensions were building that would eventually explode into the most famous war in ancient history. The Bronze Age world was becoming increasingly unstable. Trade routes were being disrupted. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries were showing signs of strain. And into this volatile situation came a prince from Troy whose arrival would change everything. Paris of Troy, or Alexander as he was also known, arrived in Sparta as part of what appeared to be a routine diplomatic mission. Troy, located in what is now northwestern Turkey, was one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age world, controlling vital trade routes between Europe and Asia and commanding immense wealth from its strategic position. But Paris's visit to Sparta was far from routine. To understand what happened next, we need to understand both the man and the world he came from. Troy, or Ilios as it was known to the Greeks, was an ancient city even in Helen's time. Archaeological excavations at the site, beginning with Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s and continuing to this day, have revealed a complex urban center that had been continuously occupied for over 1,000 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. The Troy of Helen's era, what archaeologists call Troy VIA, was a formidable fortress city. Its walls, still partially standing today, were massive constructions of carefully fitted limestone blocks that would have presented an intimidating sight to any approaching army. The city controlled the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connected the Mediterranean and Black Sea trade routes, making it incredibly wealthy and strategically vital. Priam, the king of Troy and Paris's father, ruled over not just the city itself but a confederation of allied cities and tribes that controlled much of western Anatolia. Hittite records, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, mention a place called Wilusa, which many scholars believe refers to Troy, and describe it as a significant power in the region. Paris himself remains one of the most enigmatic figures in this entire story. Ancient sources portray him as extraordinarily handsome but also somewhat effeminate by the standards of Bronze Age warrior culture. He was skilled at music and poetry but less accomplished in warfare than his brothers, particularly the great Trojan hero Hector. Some versions of the story include the famous judgment of Paris, in which the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite competed for a golden apple inscribed, "For the fairest." Paris was chosen to judge between them, and each goddess offered him a different bribe. Hera offered power, Athena offered wisdom and skill in war, and Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite's offer, and she promised him Helen. But again, we must look beyond the mythological elements to understand what this story might represent. The judgment of Paris can be read as a metaphor for different approaches to kingship and statecraft. The choice between power, military prowess, and love reflects real political decisions that rulers of the Bronze Age had to make. What we know for certain is that Paris arrived in Sparta when Menelaus was away on a diplomatic mission to Crete. This timing may not have been coincidental. If Paris came with the intention of pursuing Helen, he would have planned his arrival carefully to maximize his chances of success. The ancient sources are divided on what happened next. Some portray Helen as an innocent victim, seduced or abducted against her will. Others suggest she was a willing participant who fell genuinely in love with the Trojan prince. Still others hint at a more complex political conspiracy involving various factions within both Sparta and Troy. Let's consider each possibility. The abduction scenario paints Helen as a victim of Paris's lust and perhaps Aphrodite's divine intervention. In this version, Helen is essentially kidnapped, taken from her home and family against her will. This interpretation has been popular throughout history because it absolves Helen of responsibility for the war that followed and casts her as a tragic figure rather than a willing adulteress. The seduction scenario suggests that Helen was overwhelmed by Paris's charm, his exotic foreign appeal, and perhaps by genuine emotional and physical attraction. This version acknowledges Helen's agency while still suggesting that she was not fully responsible for her actions, being under the influence of supernatural forces. The conspiracy theory is perhaps the most intriguing from a historical perspective. Some scholars have suggested that Helen's departure with Paris was actually a carefully orchestrated political move, designed to create a pretext for war between the Greek kingdoms and Troy. In this interpretation, Helen becomes not just a cause of war but an active participant in its planning. Consider the political situation. Troy controlled crucial trade routes that Greek merchants desperately wanted access to. The city's wealth was legendary, and its strategic position made it a natural target for expansion-minded Greek kingdoms. A war against Troy would require the cooperation of multiple Greek states, and the violation of Helen's marriage provided exactly the kind of universally compelling cause needed to unite the fractious Greek kings. What actually happened in Sparta during those fateful days may never be known with certainty. But we do know that Helen left with Paris, taking with her substantial wealth and treasure from the Spartan royal house. Whether she went willingly or was taken by force, her departure created a crisis that would engulf the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. The immediate reaction in Greece was explosive. Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his kingdom's honor stained. He immediately appealed to his brother Agamemnon, and together they began calling in the oaths that Helen's suitors had sworn years before. One by one, the kings and princes of Greece began gathering their forces for what would become the greatest military expedition of the Bronze Age. But was this response really about love and honor, or were there deeper political and economic motivations at work? The Greek kingdoms had been growing in power and ambition for centuries. Trade with the East was increasingly important, and Troy's control of the Bosphorus was a constant source of frustration for Greek merchants. At the same time, the Bronze Age world was entering a period of crisis. Climate change was making agriculture more difficult. Traditional trade routes were being disrupted by various factors. Population pressures were increasing. In this context, a successful war against wealthy Troy would provide both economic opportunities and a solution to internal social tensions. Helen's journey to Troy was not a simple romantic elopement. It was a diplomatic and political earthquake that revealed the underlying tensions and ambitions of an entire civilization. As her ship sailed eastward across the Aegean, carrying her toward her new life in Troy, it carried with it the seeds of a war that would become the defining event of the Bronze Age world. The phrase "the face that launched 1,000 ships" comes from Christopher Marlowe's 16th century play, Dr. Faustus. But it captures something essential about how Helen's beauty was understood in the ancient world. In Bronze Age culture, a woman's beauty wasn't just personal. It was political, religious, and cosmic in its implications. When Helen arrived in Troy, she entered a city at the height of its power and prosperity. Troy VIIA, the archaeological level that corresponds to the traditional dating of the Trojan War, shows evidence of a thriving urban center with sophisticated architecture, extensive trade connections, and a complex social hierarchy. The city Helen would have seen was nothing like the ruins that exist today. Troy in its prime was a magnificent fortress city, its walls rising imposingly above the plain of the Scamander River. The royal palace complex would have been adorned with colorful frescoes, fine metalwork, and luxurious textiles that demonstrated Troy's wealth and connections to distant lands. Helen's arrival in Troy created both opportunity and crisis for the royal family. On one hand, securing alliance through marriage with Sparta's royal house was a significant diplomatic coup. Helen brought with her not just her legendary beauty but also substantial wealth and the potential for powerful political connections. On the other hand, Harboring the wife of a Mycenaean king was an act of tremendous provocation that threatened to upset the delicate balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Priam and his advisors must have understood that keeping Helen in Troy meant risking war with the most powerful military confederation in Greece. Why did they take this risk? Ancient sources suggest several motivations. Some emphasize the power of Helen's beauty and its effect on Paris, portraying him as so overwhelmed by passion that he couldn't consider the political consequences. Others hint at deeper strategic calculations. Perhaps Troy saw an opportunity to strike first against the growing power of the Greek kingdoms. There's also the possibility that Troy's rulers underestimated the Greek response. The Mycenaean kingdoms had never before cooperated on such a massive scale. Previous conflicts between Greek and Trojan forces had been relatively small-scale affairs. Priam might have calculated that the Greeks would be unable to maintain unity long enough to pose a serious threat to Troy's formidable defenses. Helen's life in Troy during the years before the Greek army arrived remains largely mysterious. Ancient sources provide glimpses of her situation but often contradict each other about her emotional state and her relationships within the Trojan royal family. Some accounts suggest she was welcomed warmly by Priam and Hecuba, who recognized her divine beauty and treated her as a beloved daughter-in-law. In the Iliad, Priam specifically tells Helen that he doesn't blame her for the war, suggesting that she maintained the respect of Troy's king even as the city suffered under siege. Other sources, however, hint at a more complicated situation. Later books of the Iliad suggest that many Trojans blamed Helen for their suffering and that she lived with constant guilt and regret about the consequences of her actions. In these versions, Helen is portrayed as a complex psychological figure, torn between love for Paris and anguish over the destruction her presence in Troy has caused. The historical Helen would have faced real challenges integrating into Trojan society. She was a foreigner in an alien culture, separated from her daughter and her homeland, living under the constant threat of war. Even if she had come to Troy willingly, the reality of her situation would have been difficult. At the same time, Helen's presence in Troy gave the city something it had never possessed before, a figure of such legendary beauty and divine favor that she could serve as a symbol of Troy's greatness. In a world where royal marriages were as much about prestige and divine approval as they were about politics, Helen represented a tremendous asset for Trojan propaganda. While Helen was adapting to life in Troy, the Greek kingdoms were mobilizing for war on an unprecedented scale. The assembly of the Greek fleet at Aulis represents one of the most remarkable military achievements of the Bronze Age world. Getting dozens of independent kings and princes to cooperate in a single massive expedition required diplomatic skills that we often underestimate when we focus on the mythological aspects of the story. Agamemnon, as the High King of Mycenae and leader of the expedition, had to balance competing egos, territorial ambitions, and personal grudges among his allies. The catalogue of ships in the Iliad, while obviously stylized and probably exaggerated, gives us a sense of the enormous scope of this undertaking. Modern scholars estimate that the historical expedition against Troy probably involved between 100 and 200 ships carrying somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 warriors, along with additional support personnel. This represented the largest military force assembled in the Mediterranean world up to that time, requiring unprecedented levels of planning, supply, and coordination. The economic impact of this mobilization would have been staggering. Kingdoms across Greece had to divert enormous resources from normal activities to support the expedition. Agricultural production, trade, and other essential activities were disrupted for years. The decision to maintain this effort for what ancient sources tell us was a decade-long siege represents a commitment that can only be explained by the enormous perceived stakes involved. Were those stakes really just about Helen's honor and Menelaus's wounded pride? Or were there deeper economic and strategic motivations that Helen's abduction simply provided a convenient excuse to pursue? Archaeological evidence suggests that the 13th and 12th centuries BCE were a time of increasing competition for trade routes and resources throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Great Bronze Age civilizations, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Egypt, and the various Canaanite kingdoms, were all experiencing internal pressures that made expansion and conquest attractive options. Troy's control of the Dardanelles made it a natural target for Greek expansion. The city's wealth was legendary, and its strategic position gave it enormous leverage over trade between the Black Sea region and the Mediterranean. A successful conquest of Troy would open up new markets for Greek goods and provide access to the gold, silver, and other resources of Anatolia. In this context, Helen becomes not just the cause of the war but a convenient symbol around which to organize what was essentially an economic and imperial venture. Her legendary beauty provided the emotional and moral justification needed to unite the fractious Greek kingdoms in pursuit of their collective economic interests. But this interpretation shouldn't minimize Helen's own agency and importance. Even if the war had deeper causes than her abduction, she remained a central figure whose choices and actions shaped its course. The Helen who lived in Troy during the years of preparation for war was not just a passive symbol but an active participant in one of history's most consequential conflicts. The siege of Troy traditionally lasted 10 years, though this number might be as much symbolic as literal. In ancient Near Eastern literature, significant events often lasted symbolic periods. 7 years, 10 years, 40 years, that emphasized their cosmic importance rather than providing precise chronological data. Whether the siege lasted exactly 10 years or not, it certainly continued for an extended period that strained both sides to their limits. The logistics of maintaining a large army in hostile territory for such a length of time represent one of the most remarkable military achievements of the Bronze Age world. For Helen, the siege years must have been a period of enormous psychological strain. She was living in a city under constant threat, knowing that her presence was the ostensible cause of the suffering around her. The Iliad gives us glimpses of her emotional state during this period, portraying her as a figure torn between guilt, love, and loyalty. In Homer's portrayal, Helen appears on the walls of Troy with Priam, watching the Greek forces and identifying the various heroes for the Trojan king. This scene, known as the Tychoscopia or viewing from the walls, shows Helen as a knowledgeable observer of the conflict, familiar with the Greek leaders and their capabilities. But Homer also shows us Helen's private anguish. In several passages, she expresses regret for her actions and wishes she had died before causing such suffering. She calls herself dog-faced and evil-bringing, suggesting deep self-loathing and guilt about the consequences of her choices. These psychological insights, whether they reflect historical reality or Homer's own understanding of human nature, give us a complex portrait of Helen during the siege years. She was not simply enjoying her new life with Paris while oblivious to the suffering around her. Instead, she was a deeply conflicted figure, aware of her role in the ongoing catastrophe, but unable to change the course of events. The siege itself was unlike anything the Bronze Age world had seen before. Previous conflicts had typically been relatively brief affairs, raids, battles, or short campaigns that ended quickly with the defeat of one side or the other. The idea of maintaining a siege for years required new approaches to warfare, supply, and military organization. The Greeks couldn't simply surround Troy and wait for it to surrender. The city was too well fortified and too well supplied for a simple blockade to be effective. Instead, the siege became a war of attrition, with both sides attempting to wear down their opponents through constant pressure and periodic major battles. Archaeological evidence from Troy via shows signs of the stress the city experienced during this period. The defensive walls were strengthened and rebuilt multiple times. Storage areas were expanded to hold larger quantities of food and supplies. The city's water systems were reinforced and protected against interference. At the same time, the site shows evidence of continued prosperity and trade connections even during the siege period. This suggests that Troy was not completely cut off from the outside world and that the Greeks were unable to establish a complete blockade of the city. For the Greek forces, maintaining the siege required solving unprecedented logistical problems. An army of thousands of men needed constant supplies of food, water, weapons, and other essentials. These supplies had to be transported across hundreds of miles of sea and then protected from Trojan raids and interference. The Greeks established a fortified camp on the shore near Troy, probably in the area where the modern town of Anatolian is located. Archaeological surveys have found Bronze Age remains in this region that might represent traces of the Greek siege works, though definitive identification remains elusive. From this base, the Greeks launched periodic attacks on Troy itself and on the surrounding region. The Iliad describes numerous battles and raids, not just against Troy but against the city's allies throughout western Anatolia. These campaigns served multiple purposes. They weakened Troy's support network, provided booty to help fund the continued siege, and gave the Greek warriors opportunities for glory and advancement. The extended nature of the siege also created opportunities for complex diplomatic maneuvering. Both sides attempted to win over neutral parties and to create divisions within their opponents' alliances. Helen, as a figure known throughout the ancient world, played a role in these diplomatic efforts. Some sources suggest that during the siege, various attempts were made to negotiate Helen's return and end the conflict peacefully. These negotiations apparently failed, but they indicate that Helen remained central to any potential resolution of the war. The reasons for these diplomatic failures are disputed. Some accounts suggest that Helen herself refused to return to Menelaus, preferring to remain with Paris despite the ongoing suffering. Others indicate that the Greeks had by this point invested too much in the siege to accept anything less than complete victory, including the sack of Troy and the acquisition of its legendary wealth. There's also the possibility that Helen had become, paradoxically, too valuable as a symbol for either side to give up. For the Greeks, she represented the justice of their cause and the necessity of their enormous sacrifice. For the Trojans, she had become a symbol of their ability to resist Greek aggression and maintain their independence. During the latter years of the siege, both Paris and Helen fade somewhat from the historical record as other events and personalities come to dominate the conflict. The deaths of major heroes like Patroclus and Hector, the involvement of new allies on both sides, and the increasingly desperate military situation overshadowed the romantic drama that had originally sparked the war. This shift in focus reflects the reality that the Trojan War had evolved far beyond its original causes. What began as a conflict over Helen's abduction had become a total war between two civilizations, with implications for trade, territory, and political dominance throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Helen during this period appears to have maintained her position within the Trojan royal family while becoming increasingly isolated from the wider conflict. She was no longer the central figure she had been at the war's beginning, but she remained a powerful symbol whose eventual fate would help determine the meaning of the entire struggle. As the siege dragged on and both sides suffered enormous casualties and economic strain, It became clear that the conflict would end not with negotiation or compromise, but with the complete victory of one side or the other. Helen's story was moving toward its climax, and with it the fate of one of the great cities of the ancient world. The fall of Troy, traditionally dated to around 1184 BCE, represents one of the most famous and devastating conquests in ancient history. The method of the city's capture, through the famous Trojan horse stratagem, has become legendary, but the historical reality was probably more complex and certainly more brutal than the stories suggest. Archaeological evidence from Troy VIA shows clear signs of violent destruction around this period. The city's walls were breached, buildings were burned, and there are traces of the kind of widespread fire that would result from a systematic sack. Human remains found in some areas suggest that the conquest involved significant loss of life among the civilian population. For Helen, the fall of Troy represented both liberation and a new crisis. After years of siege and the enormous suffering it had caused, the city that had been her home was now in ruins, and she faced an uncertain future as the war finally came to an end. The ancient sources provide conflicting accounts of Helen's fate during and after Troy's fall. These differences reflect not just the normal variations in oral tradition but also different moral and political perspectives on Helen's actions and their consequences. In some versions, Helen is portrayed as welcoming the Greek victory and eagerly returning to Menelaus. These accounts emphasize her essential innocence and suggest that she had been held in Troy against her will. When the city falls, she is finally free to return to her true husband and her proper place in Greek society. Other sources present a more complex picture, suggesting that Helen's feelings about the Greek victory were mixed at best. She had, after all, lived in Troy for many years. She had formed relationships, adapted to Trojan culture, and witnessed the enormous suffering that the war had brought to the city's people. The most psychologically complex accounts suggest that Helen experienced genuine conflict about her rescue. She was glad to see Menelaus again and to have the opportunity to return to Greece, but she also felt grief for the destruction of Troy and guilt about her role in causing it. There's also the question of what happened to Paris. Most sources agree that he was killed before the city's final fall, though accounts differ about the circumstances. Some suggest he died in battle like a warrior, others that he was killed by a poisoned arrow from Philoctetes. His death would have left Helen in an ambiguous position within the Trojan royal family, neither fully Trojan nor any longer connected to her original reason for being there. The reunion of Helen and Menelaus is handled differently by different ancient authors, reflecting their varying views on forgiveness, justice, and the nature of marriage. In the Iliad, Menelaus initially threatens to kill Helen when he sees her after Troy's fall, but he is overcome by her beauty and instead takes her back as his wife. This scene has been interpreted in many different ways over the centuries. Some see it as evidence of Helen's innocence and of the genuine love between her and Menelaus that ultimately transcended the pain of their separation. Others view it more cynically, as an example of how male desire and political necessity could override concerns about female autonomy and moral responsibility. The Odyssey provides a different perspective on Helen's post-war situation. When Telemachus visits Sparta looking for news of his father Odysseus, he finds Helen and Menelaus living together apparently happily. They tell stories of the war, including some in which Helen is portrayed as having helped the Greeks during the siege by providing intelligence about Troy's defenses. This portrayal of Helen as a Greek agent within Troy is historically interesting because it suggests one way to resolve the moral complexities of her story. If Helen had been secretly helping the Greeks during the siege, it would explain both her survival and her apparently comfortable reintegration into Greek society after the war. However, This interpretation raises new questions about Helen's motivations and actions. If she was helping the Greeks, was this because she regretted her original decision to leave with Paris? Was it a pragmatic choice made when she realized Troy was likely to fall? Or was it part of a more complex political game that we can no longer fully understand? The historical Helen's actual fate remains uncertain. What we do know is that the fall of Troy marked the end of one of the most significant conflicts of the Bronze Age world, and with it the conclusion of Helen's role as a central figure in Eastern Mediterranean politics. Modern archaeology has revolutionized our understanding of the historical context of Helen's story. While we cannot prove that a specific individual named Helen existed, we can now understand the world she would have inhabited with unprecedented detail and accuracy. The excavations at Troy, which began in the 1870s with Heinrich Schliemann and continue to this day under international teams of archaeologists, have revealed a complex urban center that was continuously occupied for over 3,000 years. The level known as Troy VIIA, which corresponds to the traditional dating of the Trojan War, shows clear evidence of a prosperous city that was violently destroyed around 1180 to 1150 BCE. This destruction level is particularly significant because it corresponds closely to the traditional chronology of the Trojan War and shows the kind of widespread burning and damage that would result from a successful siege and sack. The archaeological evidence doesn't prove that the war was fought over Helen, but it does confirm that Troy was indeed destroyed during the correct time period and in the violent manner described by ancient sources. The Troy revealed by archaeology was far more impressive than many scholars had expected. The city's walls, which still stand today in many places, were massive constructions that would have required enormous resources and sophisticated engineering to build. The lower city, which extends well beyond the citadel itself, covered an area of nearly 200,000 square meters, making Troy one of the largest urban centers of its time. Archaeological finds from Troy VIIA include pottery from across the Mediterranean world, indicating extensive trade connections. There are artifacts from Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, and other distant regions, confirming Troy's position as a major commercial hub. This wealth and international connection would have made Troy an attractive target for conquest and helps explain why the Greeks might have been willing to invest so heavily in its capture. The Greek side of the equation is equally well documented archaeologically. The great Mycenaean palace centers at Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, and other sites show evidence of the kind of wealth and military organization that would have been necessary to mount and sustain a major overseas expedition. Linear B tablets from Pylos provide detailed records of military equipment, personnel, and supply systems that give U.S. insight into how Bronze Age Greek kingdoms organized for war. These documents show complex administrative systems capable of coordinating large-scale military operations over extended periods. The palace at Pylos, for example, maintained detailed records of bronze smiths, chariot parts, weapons, and military personnel that suggest a sophisticated war machine. Similar records from other sites indicate that the Mycenaean kingdoms had the organizational capacity to undertake something like the expedition against Troy described in ancient sources. Archaeological evidence also supports many specific details from the literary sources. The Bronze Age Greek world did indeed consist of numerous independent kingdoms that could cooperate when necessary. These kingdoms did have the kind of warrior aristocracy described in the Iliad. They did use bronze weapons and equipment of the types mentioned in Homer's descriptions. Perhaps most importantly, archaeological evidence confirms that the late Bronze Age world was entering a period of crisis and instability around the traditional date of the Trojan War. Many Mycenaean sites show evidence of destruction, abandonment, or significant decline during the 12th century BCE. This period, known to archaeologists as the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw the end of several major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean palace system in Greece collapsed. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia fell apart. Trade networks that had existed for centuries were disrupted. Population centers were abandoned or destroyed. The causes of this widespread collapse remain debated among scholars, but climate change, internal social tensions, foreign invasions, and resource depletion all seem to have played roles. In this context, a major war between Greek kingdoms and Troy fits perfectly into the broader pattern of Bronze Age instability and conflict. Some scholars have suggested that the Trojan War might actually have been one of the causes of the Bronze Age collapse rather than just coinciding with it. The enormous resources devoted to the siege, the disruption of normal trade patterns, and the destruction of one of the region's major urban centers would all have contributed to broader economic and political instability. Archaeological evidence from Greece also provides insight into the world Helen would have known before leaving for Troy. Mycenaean palaces were elaborate complexes with sophisticated frescoes, fine metalwork, and luxury goods from across the known world. Women in these societies had significant responsibilities and could own property, manage estates, and participate in religious ceremonies. The famous warrior vase from Mycenae shows armed soldiers departing for war while women wave goodbye, providing a visual representation of the kind of scene that would have played out when the Greek expedition departed for Troy. Other artifacts show us the clothing, jewelry, weapons, and household goods that would have been familiar to someone of Helen's social status. Recent archaeological work has also revealed new information about the broader context of Greek-Anatolian relations during the Bronze Age. Hittite archives mention diplomatic relations with various Mycenaean kingdoms and conflicts involving Greek raiders or settlers in western Anatolia. One particularly intriguing set of documents involves a place called Wilusa, which many scholars now identify with Troy, and describes conflicts between the city and various forces that might represent early Greeks. These documents don't mention Helen specifically, but they do confirm that there were indeed tensions and conflicts between Greek and Trojan forces during the appropriate time period. The archaeological evidence cannot prove that Helen existed as an individual, but it does confirm that her story takes place against a historically accurate backdrop. The world described in the Iliad and other ancient sources corresponds closely to what archaeology has revealed about Bronze Age Greece and Anatolia. Helen's story didn't end with the fall of Troy. In fact, her influence on Western culture was just beginning. For over 3 millennia, Helen has remained one of literature's most compelling and controversial figures, her story constantly reinterpreted to reflect changing attitudes about women, war, beauty, and moral responsibility. In the centuries immediately following the Bronze Age collapse, Helen's story was preserved and transmitted through the oral tradition that eventually produced the Homeric epics. The Iliad and Odyssey, composed probably in the 8th century BCE, present the earliest detailed literary portraits we have of Helen, and these portrayals set the template for most later interpretations. Homer's Helen is a complex figure, beautiful beyond measure, but also deeply troubled by the consequences of her actions. She appears relatively briefly in the Iliad, but her few scenes are psychologically rich and morally ambiguous. She expresses regret for her role in causing the war, but she also seems genuinely attached to Paris and integrated into Trojan society. In the Odyssey, Helen appears as a gracious hostess in Sparta, apparently happily reconciled with Menelaus. She demonstrates her intelligence and knowledge by recognizing Telemachus and sharing stories about his father Odysseus. This portrayal suggests a mature woman who has found peace after the tumultuous events of her youth. But even in these early sources, there are contradictions and ambiguities that later authors would exploit. Was Helen a victim of divine manipulation, as suggested by the frequent references to Aphrodite's influence? Was she a willing participant in her own abduction? Did she regret her choices, or was she simply adapting to circumstances beyond her control? The archaic Greek poets who came after Homer continued to explore these questions. Sappho, the great lyric poet of Lesbos, wrote about Helen in terms that emphasized her agency and the power of erotic love. In Sappho's version, Helen willingly abandoned her family because love was more powerful than duty or social obligation. Stesichorus, another early poet, created what became known as the Palinode tradition, a version of Helen's story in which she never actually went to Troy at all. In this version, the gods created a phantom Helen to go to Troy while the real Helen spent the war years safely in Egypt. This interpretation allowed poets to preserve Helen's reputation while still maintaining the basic narrative structure of the Trojan War. The classical Athenian tragedians of the 5th century BCE found Helen's story irresistible material for exploring themes of fate, responsibility, and the relationship between individual actions and their consequences. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides all wrote plays involving Helen, each bringing their own perspective to her character and motivations. Euripides was particularly fascinated by Helen, writing 2 different plays that offered radically different interpretations of her story. In The Trojan Women, Helen appears as a manipulative figure who uses her beauty and rhetorical skill to avoid punishment for her role in Troy's destruction. In Helen, however, Euripides follows the Stesichorus tradition and presents Helen as an innocent victim who never actually committed adultery. These different theatrical interpretations reflect broader debates in classical Athens about female agency, moral responsibility, and the nature of justice. Helen became a kind of test case for thinking about how much control individuals have over their own fate and what level of responsibility they bear for the unintended consequences of their actions. Roman authors inherited these Greek traditions but added their own cultural perspectives. Virgil's Aeneid mentions Helen only briefly, but significantly. She appears as a figure of chaos and destruction whose actions have cosmic consequences for the founding of Rome itself. For Virgil, Helen represents the kind of personal passion that must be overcome for civilization to flourish. Ovid, with his characteristic interest in transformation and psychology, provided some of the most nuanced portraits of Helen in ancient literature. His Heroides includes a fictional letter from Helen to Paris that explores her internal conflict between duty to her husband and attraction to her lover. Ovid's Helen is neither purely victim nor purely villain, but a recognizably human figure struggling with competing loyalties and desires. During the medieval period, Helen's story continued to evolve as it was filtered through Christian moral frameworks. Medieval authors were often uncomfortable with Helen's adultery and the massive destruction it caused, leading to interpretations that either emphasized her victimization or her moral corruption. The Byzantine tradition preserved many ancient sources about Helen while adding new layers of interpretation. Byzantine chroniclers sometimes presented Helen as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked female sexuality, while others emphasized the tragic consequences of war and the futility of human ambition. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical sources and new artistic interpretations of Helen's story. Artists like Botticelli and writers like Marlowe created works that emphasized Helen's extraordinary beauty while exploring its moral and psychological implications. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus gave us the famous line, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships?" and presented Helen as a kind of ultimate temptation, beautiful beyond resistance but ultimately destructive to those who pursue her. The Enlightenment and Romantic periods saw Helen's story interpreted through new philosophical and psychological frameworks. authors began to explore questions about individual agency, social responsibility, and the relationship between personal desire and public good in more sophisticated ways. Goethe's Faust includes Helen as a major character who represents the classical ideal of beauty and the tragic consequences of pursuing perfection. For Goethe, Helen embodies both the highest human aspirations and their ultimate futility. The 19th century brought new archaeological discoveries that changed how Helen's story was understood. Schliemann's excavations at Troy made the ancient world seem more real and immediate, leading to renewed interest in Helen as a potentially historical figure rather than just a literary creation. At the same time, changing attitudes about women's rights and agency led to new interpretations of Helen's character. Some Victorian authors presented her as a victim of male violence and political machination, while others emphasized her strength and independence in choosing her own destiny. The 20th century saw perhaps the most diverse range of interpretations in Helen's long literary history. 2 world wars gave new relevance to stories about the devastating consequences of conflict, while changing gender roles led to fresh perspectives on Helen's choices and motivations. Modernist authors like H.D. Hilda Doolittle reimagined Helen as a complex psychological figure struggling with identity and desire in a hostile world. H.D.'s Helen in Egypt draws on the Stesichorus tradition but uses it to explore themes of memory, trauma, and recovery. Contemporary authors continue to find new ways to interpret Helen's story. Margaret Atwood, Madeline Miller, and other writers have created novels that present Helen from fresh perspectives, emphasizing her humanity while acknowledging the mythic dimensions of her story. These modern interpretations often focus on giving Helen a voice and agency that earlier versions sometimes denied her. Rather than being simply acted upon by gods, heroes, and political forces, contemporary Helen is often portrayed as an active agent making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The persistence of Helen's story across 3 millennia testifies to something fundamental about human nature and the human condition. Her tale encompasses love and war, beauty and destruction, individual desire and social responsibility, themes that remain as relevant today as they were in the Bronze Age. Whether we see Helen as victim or villain, as a real historical figure or a mythical creation, her story continues to provide a framework for thinking about some of the most challenging questions human beings face. How much control do we have over our own lives? What responsibilities do we bear for the unintended consequences of our actions? How do we balance personal happiness against social obligation? After exploring Helen's literary legacy, we must return to the fundamental historical question. What can we actually know about the real Helen of Troy? How much of her story represents historical fact, and how much is later mythological elaboration? The honest answer is that we cannot prove Helen existed as a specific individual. We have no contemporary Bronze Age records that mention her by name, no archaeological finds that can be directly connected to her, no inscriptions or documents that provide independent confirmation of her story. However, this doesn't mean that Helen is entirely mythical. The world in which she supposedly lived is increasingly well documented archaeologically, and many elements of her story correspond closely to what we know about Bronze Age society, politics, and culture. The marriage of a Spartan princess to foreign royalty would have been a significant political event in the Bronze Age world. Such marriages were common tools of diplomacy, used to seal alliances, ensure trade agreements, and prevent conflicts between powerful kingdoms. Helen's supposed divine parentage, while obviously mythological, reflects Bronze Age practices of legitimizing royal authority through claims of divine favor. Many rulers of this period claimed descent from gods or goddesses, and exceptional individuals were often said to have divine parentage. The competition among multiple suitors for Helen's hand also reflects historical reality. Marriages involving major royal houses regularly attracted numerous candidates, and the choice of spouse could have significant political implications for entire regions. The Oath of Tyndareus, while it may not have existed exactly as described in later sources, represents the kind of mutual defense pact that Bronze Age kingdoms did create. Archaeological evidence and Hittite diplomatic archives show that complex alliance systems were common during this period. Helen's supposed extraordinary beauty, while clearly exaggerated in later sources, might reflect a historical reality. In societies where royal marriages were political tools, personal attributes like beauty, intelligence, and charisma could have genuine political importance. The idea that Helen's abduction could trigger a major international war is entirely plausible from a historical perspective. Bronze Age kingdoms did fight wars over trade routes, territorial disputes, and dynastic claims. The violation of a marriage alliance could easily provide the pretext for broader conflicts that had deeper economic and political causes. Troy itself was certainly real and certainly important enough to attract Greek attention. Archaeological evidence confirms that it was a wealthy, well-fortified city with extensive trade connections throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Its strategic position controlling access to the Black Sea made it a natural target for expansion-minded Greek kingdoms. The 10-year siege, while the specific duration may be symbolic rather than literal, represents the kind of extended conflict that Bronze Age powers could sustain when the stakes were high enough. The logistics of maintaining large armies in hostile territory for extended periods were certainly challenging, but not impossible given the resources available to Mycenaean kingdoms. The fall of Troy around 1180 to 1150 BCE is confirmed by archaeological evidence, and the violence of its destruction matches the kind of devastation described in ancient sources. Whether this destruction was caused specifically by a Greek expedition seeking to recover Helen is unknowable, but it certainly could have been. Helen's fate after Troy's fall. Her return to Sparta and apparent reconciliation with Menelaus represents the kind of political resolution that might well have occurred in such circumstances. Royal women who found themselves in politically awkward situations often managed to survive and adapt, sometimes with remarkable success. So what might the real Helen have been like? If she existed, she was probably a Spartan princess born sometime in the late 13th century BCE. She would have grown up in the sophisticated world of Mycenaean palace culture, receiving the kind of education appropriate for a woman of the highest social rank. She would have been beautiful, certainly, but her beauty would have been enhanced by the finest clothing, jewelry, and cosmetics available in the Bronze Age world. Her education would have included music, dancing, religious knowledge, and the social skills necessary for royal life. Her marriage to Menelaus would have been arranged primarily for political reasons, though this doesn't mean it was necessarily unhappy. Many Bronze Age royal marriages seem to have developed into genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and shared interests. If Helen did leave Sparta for Troy, it might have been because she fell genuinely in love with Paris, or because she was coerced, or because the departure was actually part of a more complex political arrangement that we no longer understand. Her life in Troy would have been comfortable but probably isolated. As a foreigner married to a prince of a potentially hostile power, she would have occupied a delicate position within Trojan society. During the siege, she would have experienced the full horror of Bronze Age warfare, the constant threat of death, the gradual exhaustion of resources, the loss of friends and family members. Her survival through this period would have required considerable strength and adaptability. After Troy's fall, her return to Sparta would have required careful negotiation and probably significant political compromise on all sides. Her successful reintegration into Greek society suggests either that she was genuinely seen as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, or that the political advantages of her return outweighed any moral concerns about her behavior. The historical Helen, if she existed, was probably a far more complex and capable individual than the passive figure of beauty that dominates many later interpretations. Surviving and thriving through the kind of political upheavals described in her story would have required intelligence, courage, and considerable political skill. She would have been a product of her time and culture, sharing the values and assumptions of Bronze Age aristocracy while also being shaped by her unique experiences and exceptional circumstances. Whether Helen was a real person or a composite figure based on various historical women, her story reflects authentic aspects of Bronze Age life, politics, and culture. The world in which she supposedly lived was real, the conflicts it describes were the kind that actually occurred, and the social dynamics it portrays match what we know about Mycenaean and Anatolian societies. In this sense, Helen is historically real, even if we cannot prove her individual existence. She represents the experiences and challenges faced by royal women in the Bronze Age world, and her story provides insight into the political, social, and cultural forces that shaped one of history's most important transitional periods. As we reach the end of our journey through Helen's story, it's worth reflecting on why this ancient tale continues to captivate us after more than 3 millennia. Helen of Troy represents something fundamental about human nature and the human condition that transcends the specific historical circumstances of Bronze Age Greece. Her story encompasses all the great themes of literature and life: love and duty, beauty and destruction, individual choice and collective consequence, the power of desire and the price of fulfillment. These themes remain as relevant today as they were in the ancient world, which explains why each generation has found new ways to interpret and retell Helen's tale. From a historical perspective, Helen's story provides a window into one of the most important periods of human development. The Late Bronze Age was a time of unprecedented cultural exchange, technological advancement, and political complexity. The collapse of this sophisticated world around 1200 BCE marked the end of civilization's first truly international age and led to centuries of cultural darkness from which Europe only gradually emerged. Helen's story, whether historically accurate in its details or not, captures something essential about this lost world. It shows us a sophisticated society capable of mounting complex military operations, maintaining extensive trade networks, and creating works of art and literature that still move us today. The archaeological record confirms many aspects of the world described in Helen's story, while adding new dimensions that the ancient sources could not have imagined. Modern excavations have revealed the true scale and sophistication of Bronze Age civilizations, making the conflicts described in the Iliad seem not just plausible but almost inevitable. The real significance of Helen's story may lie not in whether she existed as an individual, but in what her tale tells us about the values, ambitions, and challenges of the ancient world. Her story reflects the tensions between personal desire and social obligation, between individual agency and collective responsibility, that characterized Bronze Age society and continue to challenge us today. Helen also represents something important about the role of women in ancient society. While Bronze Age women generally had fewer rights and opportunities than men, royal women like Helen could wield considerable influence and were often active participants in the political life of their kingdoms. Helen's story, in all its various versions, gives us one of our most detailed portraits of how exceptional women navigated the complex social and political landscape of the ancient world. Whether she was victim or agent, innocent or guilty, she represents the possibilities and limitations that shaped women's lives in one of history's most formative periods. the literary legacy of Helen's story is equally important. The Iliad remains one of the foundational texts of Western literature, and Helen's role in that epic has influenced how we think about heroism, tragedy, and moral responsibility for thousands of years. Later retellings and reinterpretations of Helen's story have continued to explore these themes while adding new layers of meaning and complexity. Each generation has found in Helen's tale a reflection of its own concerns and challenges, ensuring that her story remains alive and relevant. Contemporary treatments of Helen's story often focus on giving her a voice and agency that earlier versions sometimes denied. Modern authors have reimagined her as a complex psychological figure struggling with impossible choices, rather than simply as an object of male desire or divine manipulation. These modern interpretations reflect changing attitudes about women's roles and rights, but they also reveal something timeless about Helen's story. At its core, her tale is about a human being trying to make the best choices possible in difficult circumstances, and then living with the consequences of those choices. This is a challenge that every person faces, regardless of their historical period or social position. We all must navigate between competing loyalties and desires, and we all must live with the unintended consequences of our decisions. Helen's story also reminds us of the complex relationship between individual actions and historical forces. Did Helen cause the Trojan War? Or was she simply caught up in political and economic conflicts that were inevitable regardless of her personal choices? This question goes to the heart of how we understand historical causation and moral responsibility. It reminds us that great events typically have multiple causes, and that individual actions, however dramatic, always occur within broader social, political, and economic contexts. The archaeological evidence we've examined suggests that the Bronze Age world was indeed moving toward crisis and conflict in the period when Helen supposedly lived. Climate change, resource competition, political instability, and social tensions were all creating pressures that made large-scale conflicts increasingly likely. In this context, Helen's abduction may have been more symptom than cause, a dramatic trigger for conflicts that would have occurred in some form regardless. This doesn't diminish the importance of individual choices and actions, but it does remind us that history is always more complex than simple narratives of cause and effect. Helen's enduring fascination also reflects our continuing struggle to understand the relationship between beauty and value, between appearance and reality. In a culture that often reduces women to their physical appearance, Helen's story provides a complex meditation on the power and burden of exceptional beauty. Her tale reminds us that beauty, however genuine, cannot by itself provide meaning or happiness. The most beautiful woman in the world still faced the same fundamental human challenges as everyone else. The need to find purpose, to build relationships, to navigate moral dilemmas, and to create a meaningful life. Perhaps most importantly, Helen's story reminds us of the devastating consequences of war and conflict. Whatever her personal role in triggering the Trojan War, her tale ultimately serves as a powerful reminder of how individual actions can escalate into collective tragedies that destroy entire civilizations. The fall of Troy represents not just the end of one city, but the collapse of an entire world. The Bronze Age civilization that had flourished for centuries was swept away, taking with it sophisticated technologies, complex trade networks, and cultural achievements that would not be equaled again for hundreds of years. Helen's story thus serves as both historical record and cautionary tale. It reminds us of what can be lost when conflicts escalate beyond the point of peaceful resolution, and it challenges us to think carefully about the potential consequences of our own choices and actions. As we close this exploration of Helen's story, we're left with a figure who remains as complex and compelling as she was 3,000 years ago. Whether we see her as history's most beautiful woman, its most tragic victim, or its most consequential figure, she continues to embody fundamental questions about human nature and the human condition. Helen of Troy was many things: a Bronze Age princess, a symbol of beauty, a cause of war, a literary creation, and an enduring mystery. But perhaps most importantly, she was and remains a mirror in which we can see reflected our own struggles with love and duty, desire and responsibility, individual choice and collective consequence. Her story began in the sophisticated palace culture of Mycenaean Greece, but it lives on wherever human beings grapple with the eternal questions of how to live, how to love, and how to bear responsibility for our actions in an uncertain and often dangerous world. In this sense, Helen of Troy is not just a figure from the distant past, but a continuing presence in human culture, a reminder of both our highest aspirations and our most tragic limitations. The face that launched 1,000 ships continues to launch new stories, new interpretations, and new insights into the enduring mysteries of human nature. 3 millennia after her supposed death, Helen of Troy remains vibrantly alive in human imagination, challenging each generation to find new meaning in her ancient tale. And so we leave Helen as we found her, beautiful, mysterious, and eternally compelling. Whether she walked the walls of Troy as a real woman or exists only in the realm of story and symbol, she remains one of history's most powerful reminders of the complex relationship between individual choice and historical consequence, between personal desire and collective destiny. In the end, perhaps that's the real story of Helen of Troy. Not the specific details of her life and death, but the enduring human questions her story continues to ask and the timeless truths it continues to reveal about who we are and who we might become. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most enduring mysteries. The story of Helen of Troy reminds us that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the stories we tell, the questions we ask, and the truths we discover about ourselves along the way. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your own journey through history be filled with wonder and discovery.